My name is Jason Dupuis. I'm the Patient Experience Officer for PM Pediatrics, and we appreciate everybody's time. Those joining us that don't work for PM, it's great to have you here. I saw on the list, I don't know if you logged in, but I saw some former colleagues from Boston Children's, so I'd like to shout out to you guys for joining and hearing what we have to say today. And it was quite a great list of folks that are joining for this talk. So any feedback, please submit it, email it. I would love to hear it. What you're going to hear today is a talk on the psychology of waiting. It's very fun. At least I think it's very fun to talk about this stuff. And really, this is a teaser for PUC, which is a Pediatric Urgent Care Conference. This is a lecture that we're adapting to be used at that conference. So if you haven't heard about PUC before, give it a look. There's a lot of great content there. There's a whole patient experience day, and then there's a lot of other opportunities to learn clinical skills related to urgent care. So just a bit of a shameless plug there. So let's go ahead and kick off here. I have to have this financial disclosure slide. And I always say I hope to one day have so many of the slides filled with them. I don't even really know what that is, so maybe I should figure that out. But I know I don't have any because I would know what they were. At any rate, so here's our objectives for today. We're going to understand the impact of instant gratification on modern consumerism and why it matters in healthcare. And there's a lot of conversation around whether instant gratification and this idea of instant gratification and consumerism belongs in healthcare. We can debate that till we're blue in the face. I'm here to tell you it's in healthcare, and it's our job collectively as an industry, for your practice, for your location, for your hospital, to really think about this stuff and how you are interacting with your patient family populations, because society now, including ourselves, and we'll talk about that in a second, we're used to instant gratification. We want instant gratification. We've been conditioned to instant gratification, and so we really need to think about that and how it impacts our business models, no matter what sector of healthcare you're in. We're going to explore and, I say, decode these 7 tenets behind the psychology of waiting in healthcare. This was actually, this talk was built around an article that was written by David Meister in 2005 called The Psychology of Waiting Lines. And this has been studied for years and years, and what's fascinating about the psychology of waiting is it's largely unchanged from the 60s and 70s forward. And that's because humans don't evolve that much. Now, the society changes, right? And what we expect from organizations and businesses change. But the actual tenets of our psychology and how we interpret and process things hasn't really changed that much, which is really fascinating. So we're going to talk about those 7 tenets and how they apply to healthcare. And then last but not least, we'll discuss some techniques for each of the tenets to augment the perception of wait time without reducing the actual amount of time waiting. So one of the things that we all know that work in healthcare is speed is always important. Nothing about the talk today is to say being efficient in your process isn't important. But we're not here today to talk about how do we reduce waiting time. We're going to talk about the fact that waits exist. They exist whether you're running a cardiology clinic in a hospital, they're waiting for the provider, whether you're running a pediatric practice, a primary care practice, waiting occurs in your office, and urgent care and ED, this is the same across the board. And so what we're really focused on today is the perception of the wait time, how people feel about how they're waiting, not the actual amount of time that they're waiting. And so graphically, it's very easy to say, when you talk about things like length of stay or from time to check in to check out, right, that's on the other side of the brain with data and analytics and the science. And today we're really trying to focus on that other side of the brain, the art side of the brain, to talk about the psychology around how we feel about waiting and how we can mess and manipulate with that. So it is a weird balance though. And it's not simple. It's not simple like stacking flat objects on top of each other. It's kind of like putting these gnarly pieces together and finding this perfect balance between what otherwise can be seen as 2 competing things. Length of stay versus how someone feels about wait time, right? And so there's a gnarly balance that we want to strike here, because I'm not implying or saying that providers should be inefficient and just manage how someone feels about a wait. I'm saying that we need to find the balance between those 2 things, but I want to acknowledge that it's gnarly, that it can be very difficult, and that it varies at the individual level. My expectations and your friends' expectations are very different because our wants and needs are different when it comes to things like waiting or getting service or having care delivered. So I'll ask this question. Those that are tuned in, we can't hear you, you can hear us, but there are people in the room that will answer these questions for you so you can hear their responses. But I want to ask this question. What's more important? How long you wait for something, or how you spend that time waiting? Does anybody have an answer or feeling on how they feel about that? What's more important to you? How long you wait, or how you spend that time waiting?
How long?
Someone answers. How long? What? Everyone agrees on how long? Is anyone more concerned about, go ahead. You're more concerned about the aspect of how you feel about the time spent waiting. There's always both sides of that when you think about it, and that's just an example of how we're different as humans and what we want out of our waiting experiences. Now, interestingly, I use the marshmallow study. Is everyone familiar with the marshmallow study where they put the marshmallow in front of the kid and they time and they see how patient they are? Did anyone see that it recently came out? Kids today are actually more patient than they were in the past, which is a very confusing study result when we're here talking about this idea of instant gratification. What it might be indicative of is that in the future, as those children grow up, maybe they'll be less demanding, right, of the time, but the reality is their parents, us, right, we won't wait for the marshmallow. We'll eat that thing sooner than the kids today will eat it. But I thought it was fascinating that we're all starting to see this shift in scientific studies in the marshmallow study. So if you haven't looked up the marshmallow study, it's fascinating, it's fun to read about. And this little girl, like, I love it. Look at that deep stare she has at that marshmallow, right, and how long she could wait before she eats it. All right. So now I want everyone to ask themselves this question. How long are you willing to wait for a coffee at Starbucks? Now, you don't have to answer out loud, because I'll tell you your answer to that. Everyone uses the mobile app mostly now, so if you drink coffee at Starbucks, if you're like me, you order your coffee in your mobile app, and it says 3 to 7 minutes, and then you arrive 7 minutes later, perfectly timed, and you walk in and you grab your coffee and you walk out. You are conditioned for instant gratification because you knew exactly when you needed to arrive. You time your order appropriately. Now, if you walk into Starbucks at the 8-minute mark and your coffee's not in the hopper, you actually probably feel a little upset about that. Is that fair? And the reason you feel upset about that is that you were made a promise that was not delivered on. You had a promise that was broken, okay? So we're going to talk a lot about later on how you use times, but we have to be very careful because when you use times, you create promises, and when you break promises, it creates problems, right? But Starbucks has started to condition us, or is conditioning us, for instant gratification, getting a coffee when you want it, right when you arrive, on time, within a time frame. Now, what about Amazon? How long are you willing to wait anymore for a package from Amazon? Now,
2 Prime days.
2 Prime days, maybe. I want it tomorrow, right? And they offer you Prime for a reason. Now, one-click buy, I just read an article about this yesterday, actually. Amazon started offering one-click buy. The reason they offered that was because of the abandoned shopping cart. It had nothing to do with waiting times. It had to do with people putting things in the cart and then perseverating over them and not buying them. So they came up with this idea that, well, one click is faster, it's easier, and people will purchase because it's so easy, they won't perseverate, they'll just make the buying decision, right? But that's another way that we all in this room and everyone listening has been conditioned to instant gratification because now we can pay for Prime and have packages tomorrow or 2 days from now, right? And I always make the joke with Prime, I don't even know what they charge for it, but it's not enough. I would pay more than whatever they're paying. And I actually don't even know what they charge, but I'm convinced it's not enough because I want that stuff tomorrow. And I like the fact that when I buy something that I don't really need, that I just want, I can have it tomorrow without going anywhere. So I've been conditioned to instant gratification. How about a text message response? So you send a text message, what's your expectation of response time from the person that you send that text to? It's instant. You expect to see those 3 little dots, right? Is that fair? And if you don't see the 3 little dots, you're like, why aren't they responding, right? So the 3 little dots is also conditioning us to instant gratification because we know where they're responding, and we'll stand there and we'll watch and we'll listen, right? Or watch for the message to pop, or we'll listen for the ding to go off. But our expectation of a text message is faster communication than an email, but avoids a phone call, which is usually a prolonged interaction, right? We're looking for quick bursts, instant gratification. What about a Google search? How fast do you want Google to take to come back with over 1 million results about what you just put in? You want it right now, and it's amazing. And then you have to scroll through the list, but their AI is so strong, you can get usually the answer you want in the first few, and they know how to do it. Now, a house is a different one, because we spend longer on that. We're willing to take more time to buy a house than we'll accept for a coffee or an Amazon package or a Google search or a text message. But if you look at the time from a buyer being interested in buying a house to actually buying a house, it has significantly and drastically shrunk. Why? Because there's apps out there now that I can see every house for sale within 30 miles of my house in this price range that has this many bedrooms, that has this many bathrooms. That narrowing used to take weeks and weeks with a real estate agent to pour through listings. So even in the housing market, something that historically takes a long time, we've been conditioned to be able to make a decision about buying a house, a huge expenditure, hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars, very quickly now because the technology and the systems allow us. And then how long are you willing to wait for your wife to get ready, right? Now that number's infinite. You wait until she's ready, right? All right, so here's the $1 million question. This is what we're trying to solve. So what's a reasonable amount of time for a patient or a family to wait at your practice to be seen by a provider? Someone blurt out, what's the reasonable amount of time here in the room? What's the reasonable amount of time for somebody to wait at your site to be seen by a provider?
An hour.
An hour. Anybody else? It's a trick question. That's not the question. The question really is, how long do you want to wait with your sick child to be seen by a provider? That's the million-dollar question. So what I'm saying here, in order for us to do this psychology of waiting idea justice, we in this room and listening have to shift our paradigm. So when you look at this picture, you either see a rabbit or a duck. Okay? Now, if you're seeing a rabbit, find the duck. If you see the duck, find the rabbit. That's the way we need to shift our paradigm. You need to put yourself in the position of how long is it reasonable for a family to wait for a sick child if that was you. And you need to build your system around understanding how you impact that wait. And remember, we're not trying to fix length of stay here. What we're trying to fix is how people feel about the wait. So you need to put things in place that manipulate that feeling without changing that time. But we have to shift our paradigm to do it, to appreciate the importance of it enough to actually execute to it. Right? So that in order for this to work, in order to get into psychology and the art, we have to shift our paradigm and see it from their perspective. We can't see it from the complexity of our emergency department, the complexity of our scheduling system in a hospital, the complexity or the unpredictability of an urgent care environment. We have to see it from their perspective. So now we're going to walk through the 7 factors. Now that everyone shifted their paradigm, saw the duck or the rabbit. And again, this was adapted from David Meister's Psychology of Waiting in Lines in 2005, and I've, of course, put my own kind of spin on these because we needed to apply them specifically to healthcare. So the first factor we have to think about is unoccupied time feels longer than occupied time. Now, if you haven't read anything about the psychology of waiting, you're going to see that these 7 tenets, none of them are rocket science. All of them are going to be obvious, and you're going to think like, well, of course. But there's a reason why this exists, and there's an opportunity for us to think about this differently. So I'm going to show you the factors. We'll talk a little bit about what it means, and then I'll try to provide some solutions to get the gears going about what we or you could be doing differently to support the psychology of waiting in your practice. So my favorite example of occupying time is this. Have you ever noticed that when you're in a hotel, which I travel a lot for work, so I spend a lot of time in hotels, that in the elevator lobby on your floor, there's a mirror? That is specifically there because of the psychology of waiting, because it turns out humans are vain and we like to look at ourselves in the mirror. So they put that there because when you're standing there waiting for the elevator, you look at yourself in the mirror and you make sure, if you're me, that your buttons align with your belt, because my dad was in the Army. You make sure if you're a guy, your fly's zipped, right? You make sure your shirt's tucked in. You're like, geez, I could stand to lose a few pounds, but if I stand this way, it's okay, right? But you've occupied yourself. It's intentional that it's there. It's not so you can make sure you look right, so they can occupy your time while you're waiting for an elevator. That's why it's there. So it's this idea of like, this is not complex to do. This is very simple, and the cost of it is very small. So we think about the solution is simple too. We have to occupy time. So now, I was thinking about this, and there's a million ways that you can do this. But I'm also somebody that believes, like, don't overshoot this. It's pretty simple. So you think about, well, what simple looks like in a pediatric environment. So I was like, I bet if I Google activity sheet, a million will come up, right? Instantly, we just talked about that. So I Google it. The first thing that showed up is this shark activity sheet. It has a word find, draw a picture of a shark, and 2 games of tic-tac-toe. Very, very simple. It buys you a couple minutes of occupied time for a parent and a child, right? Now, there's millions of these out there, millions of variations of this. But what I'm arguing here for occupying time is don't overthink this. Keep it simple. And you need lots of options. It needs to be ample. So you think about snacks. Well, if you just have goldfish, it's going to be hard. You should have different things, different types of things. It should be spread throughout your environment so there's access to different things at different locations. Right? I know at PM Pediatrics, in the back we have the freeze pops. Right? Sure, you can have a freeze pop out front, I guess, if you really want one. But we have them for different things and we leverage them for different things. So make sure that whatever you're doing to occupy time, there's ample options. And then we need to make sure it's dynamic. These are my 3 kids. That's Trevor, Abby, and Teddy, 8, 5, and 2. This is when we cut down our Christmas tree this year. But Trevor, it plays with different things than Abby, that plays with different things than Teddy. So whatever you're offering can't be just for 5-year-olds or 8-year-olds or 12-year-olds or 16-year-olds. And I mention this because that's why TVs in waiting rooms are complicated. They're complicated because they can only play one show. So everyone's initial reaction is like, well, we have TVs in the waiting room. It's like, well, if you're a pediatric environment, your age is anywhere from 0 to 21, let's say, or 26, whatever your range is, it's not that Disney Junior doesn't cut it for everyone. So you need other things to make sure that it's dynamic enough to occupy the time of everyone you may see, not a small few, right? Wait time factor number 2, anxiety makes wait time seem longer. Now, this is a problem for us in healthcare because our patients and families are rife with anxiety, right? So what's our solution to something like this? How do we reduce anxiety? We talk about providing reassurance and affirmation. And we do that predominantly with words, right? You made the right choice by coming in to have them seen today. A sign of affirmation, right? You made a good decision. Parents are often coming into emergency departments or urgent cares or for a visit, an urgent visit at a pediatrician's office because they're worried about their child. So if their wait time is going to feel longer, if they're anxiety induced, then the sooner you can reduce anxiety through providing reassurance and affirmation at the front of the house, through the back of the house, they'll feel better about the time that you ask them to wait. So we think about things like, you're never alone when you're here. Let us know what we can do to help. And I always say, at PM, and this is true of every environment, this isn't just solely rested on the provider, right? This is everyone providing affirmation, everyone providing that reassurance. It's a team responsibility. And the better the team is at doing something like this, right, the stronger the affirmation or the reduction of anxiety will be. Thank you for trusting us to care for your little one. You're in the right place. Again, similar. But now we're pulling out other things, like the importance of thanking them for trusting us to care for their child. Right? We were talking earlier here at PM about this idea that it takes a lot for a parent to come in. They're worried, they're scared, they're anxious, and they trust you to put hands on their child. They trust you to help their child. That's a big deal for a parent to entrust somebody to do that. So letting them know or thanking them for trusting you to take care of them is actually really important to reducing that anxiety and making them feel like, 1, they made a good decision, and 2, they're in the right place. And then also building that, being empathetic or compassionate or building that relationship with them. As a father, I would have been concerned too, right? Everything's going to be okay. Like oftentimes we worry about using words like everything's going to be okay. But when you know it's going to be okay, why can't you say that, right? Again, it's affirmation and it's reassurance that things are okay and that they're in the right place. So if we want to reduce anxiety, it has to be done by the whole team. And more importantly, we have to do it throughout the visit so they constantly get that reassurance about the anxiety, because their anxiety levels go up and down depending on what's happening in the care process, right? If they're there looking for an antibiotic, let's pretend, and you're not giving them an antibiotic, right? They're going to have more anxiety because they think they need one. So it's going to go back up. So we need to make sure that we constantly provide that. The third factor, uncertain waits are longer than known or finite waits. Right? And we've all been in that situation, and this one is really tricky. This is where in healthcare we just play with fire, okay? It's this idea that like, man, there's a really delicate balance or a really fine line that we're trying to strike here about making uncertain waits more finite or known. So we talk about how do you rectify that uncertainty? So I mentioned this earlier, and I'm going to reiterate. The first no-no in all of this is breaking a promise, okay? So we talk about, well, what do? Do you say number of patients that go before me? Do you use time? What do you use? And I say, no matter what you're using, you need to make sure that it doesn't create a promise that you break. So if you're making a promise, you have to deliver on that promise. Of course, we want to under-promise and over-deliver. This is a wait time sign at the Slinky Dog Dash at Disney, okay? Now, if you know anything about Disney, they're one of the best companies in the entire world. In fact, if you try to find a company that you put in like great companies that manage waits wonderfully, it's Disney, 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 right? It goes all the way down. They have this stuff down. They've turned art into science. Now, if you know anything about Disney though, you'll know that that 90 minutes is untrue. It's always shorter. Under promise, over deliver. So by the time you just stood in line for 90 minutes to ride the Slinky Dog Dash with your 3 kids and you're like, oh, it only took 85 minutes. You're like, oh, that's great. The sign back there said it was going to be 90. They create a win out of an hour and 25-minute wait, right? Just by under-promising and over-deliver. So whatever you're doing in your model on that uncertainty, make sure that you under-promise and you over-deliver. We're learning this from Disney, right? They're using times, but they have their times down to a science. They understand it, and they make sure that they come in under it. And that's how they make sure they don't break the promise. Because they know if they start breaking promises, their guest services office is going to get overwhelmed. Now, when you read this psychology of waiting, they're going to tell you time is best. They're going to say that that's the secret, right? But then we have to remember, number one, that it puts us in a position to break a promise. But it is best because when they study humans, if I say to you, it's going to be 20 minutes, you actually feel better about your weight than if I told you you're third in line, or if I told you the doctor will be with you soon. They've been able to study this and show that time is actually best. And the interesting thing, at least in my experience, in my former life being in an emergency department, is that time scares the crap out of everyone because of breaking promises and not being able to deliver on the time, right? So there's a few things I wanted to mention here that I think are really important about the time, is that when you say them, there are things, you just have to be careful. So a rapid strep test in an urgent care environment takes about 5 minutes to run. Is that correct, my friends? About 5 minutes. Oftentimes, I can tell you from our data, our critique data from patients and families, is that they'll say, someone told me the rapid strep test was going to take 5 minutes. They didn't come back for 20 minutes. And I'm like, okay, so we used a time. What we didn't factor in is it takes us 5 minutes to run the test, but we may not be back for 20 minutes because we do something else while that strep test is running, right? So if you're using times in your environment, just be very careful about the time that you're using and make sure that it's actually accurate, right? So it does take 5 minutes to run a rapid strep, but you need to make sure that it may take you 20 minutes before you're back in the room. So once you say a time, your accountability is to that time. So in emergency departments, they often do this where they know the turnaround times of, say, labs, but they're afraid to actually share them. And what I'm advocating for and what the psychology of waiting has taught us is if you know the times, you should find a way to share them. And if you know it takes 20 minutes, tell someone it takes 30 minutes. They're going to wait much nicer. And if you come in you under-promise and over-deliver, it's hugely impactful. All right? All right, the fourth factor. Unexplained waits are longer than explained waits. Now, again, I mentioned earlier that I travel a lot. If you've not been on the other side of a board that looks like this when you're flying, you haven't lived, right? You come in and you just see this, cancel, cancel, cancel now. Now, what's fascinating is that airlines deal with this all the time as far as you see that your flight's delayed, but you have no understanding of why, which causes you severe anger, frustration, anxiety, right? Because you want something on the other side of that. What I've been fascinated by is, and I use JetBlue on purpose, I fly JetBlue for work frequently, but I always use them as an example because they actually have started doing a lot more in explaining the waits so that people don't grow agitated or upset with them. Now, what's also interesting about explained and unexplained waits is it's okay to apologize for things that are outside of your control. So what JetBlue started doing was basically saying, hey, we're really sorry that your flight got delayed. But the reason the flight got delayed was because of a thunderstorm, and it turns out if you fly an airplane into a thunderstorm, that's bad, right? Now, can they control the weather? No. Were they willing to say, hey, sorry? But the reason the delay happened was of weather. We're really sorry that it happened. It means something because you've apologized for the impact. Recently, a colleague sent me, Amtrak had an accident. It delayed his train, and they sent an apology saying, look, we know your time is valuable. We know you were trying to get where you were going, and we came up short, and we're sorry. Right? So this idea that when we do start explaining waits, which is what we need to do, that we also need to be willing to apologize, even if the explanation for the wait is outside of our control. And so, first, I always want to point out, hope's not a plan, ever. Okay? So we can't hope that everyone in the waiting room sees all the other people waiting and will understand that you're busy. Okay? And we know that's not true, particularly in pediatrics, because the parent that's sitting there has tunnel vision. They're very much just focused on their child, their schedule, their life, their disruption, their need to get back to work, their need that the fact that they're missing work, the need for the child to go back to school, whether or not they can play in the next game, right? They're very focused on that. So they're not focused on the number of people in the waiting room. They don't care that you have 2 doctors working or 5 doctors working when you should have 10. They don't think about any of that. So we can't just operate on an assumption about waits that they'll just understand. Hope's not a plan. We also want to be careful that our strategy isn't reactive, but proactive, right? So if somebody's drowning and you're throwing a life ring, it's too late, right? So the idea of a life jacket is it's a proactive approach. So the sooner you can explain what's going on, keeps you out of the service recovery reactive approach to trying to de-escalate a family or managing frustrations. So you need to be proactive with that. And our recommendation about being proactive with that is make sure that you build some sort of rounding strategy that works for your environment. And more importantly, it needs to be a rounding strategy that considers all aspects of your environment. So, oftentimes we think about the care delivery model is broken up into two parts. There's the front of the house, registration, check-in, the waiting room, and then the back of the house, the care rooms, those sorts of things. When I chat with people, not just at PM Pediatrics, but out in the industry, what we often find is we spend a fair amount of time focusing on the internal, the care room, like checking in with people. People go in and out of the room. Maybe it's the MA, maybe it's the nurse, maybe it's the x-ray tech, maybe it's the provider. But oftentimes, because we put people in a waiting room, in a hopper, we're like, well, the assumption there is that they wait. So we need to make sure that if you have a rounding strategy, that it's proactive enough that it covers the people that are coming in the door and are having their wait out front before they get back into a care room where they also have an additional wait. It creates kind of a very fascinating dynamic. So make sure that in explaining waits, we're explaining them from the moment they arrive, while they're in the care room, all the way up to time of departure, about what's causing them to wait, the why, and the what. Our fifth factor is that unfair waits are longer than fair waits. Again, nothing about this is rocket science or earth-shattering, but it's important to understand how we get to the perception of an unfair wait. And a lot of it is a lack of understanding of your system and your process. And so what humans do when we enter a system is we try to figure out the process. And if you don't explain it to me, then I'm left to interpret it by myself, which I make my own assumptions about your process. I also make my own assumptions about what works and what doesn't work, why it's broken, right? I start making basically chaos into logic and reason. But when I'm doing that, I start making wrong assumptions. So we need to make sure that we kill those perceptions up front to ensure that they understand the process and that they at least see some semblance of fairness in how it works, and where there could be perceived unfair or lack of fairness, that we explain that to them. So if we think about a family going into any environment, they see the process as being relatively linear. I'm going to walk in, they know it, right? It's an algorithm. I'm going to walk in, I'm going to get registered, I'm going to get placed in a room, doctor's going to see me, they're going to hand me some cool papers, I'm going to shove them in my purse, probably never read them, right? And then I'm going to go home. But we know the process kind of looks like this, right? Especially if you're in an emergency or an urgent care, if you're in a surgical suite with different, managing surgical cases, that sort of thing, a cath lab, right? A to B is very complicated. All this stuff happens in between. So a family's coming in expecting a very algorithmic process, right? But what the process actually looks like is very complicated. It's confusing, right? They can't figure it out, so they start putting fingers in holes and plugging and making assumptions and taking leaps. And so in most models, what we've been conditioned to, and think about this, we've been conditioned to first in, first out. That's the psychology of waiting lines. I get in line at Starbucks if I don't use the mobile app, and I wait my turn and I order my drink, and the drinks generally come out in the order with which they were ordered. Now, I'm willing to wager that if you've done that and you've seen the guy behind you get his drink first, you're like, what's going on, right? Because we've been conditioned to this first in, first out model. It's a queuing theory, right? And so we're like, well, that wasn't fair because he jumped the line. But part of the reason that happens sometimes is it's just the logic of where things are, and they're multitasking and doing different things. So if you use a first in, first out system, any time that you deviate from that system, so say an acute patient comes in and they jump the line, there's an explanation that needs to happen to make sure that you're explaining why that makes sense, right? We can't just assume families will understand that. We have to help them understand. And so we need to make what's otherwise blurry clear, and it needs to be transparent. Your process deserves to be transparent to a patient or family so that they understand how it works and where they fit in that process, so they don't make assumptions on their own. The second, as we've said already, is it needs to go start to finish. This isn't a back end, front end. This is all the way through the whole thing. The waiting room, all the way up through the care delivery process to the moment they walk out the door, right? It needs to be a fair process. When you put families into care rooms, for example, if they're in there for a little bit, we know what they do. They look out. And things they don't like seeing is you rooming other patients, or a doctor going into a room of another patient you roomed at the same time, and they feel like they should be seen first. Right? So we have to think about what is it that they might see in our process that they would perceive as unfair, and make sure that we manage to that expectation, knowing they're not just going to go into that room and sit there for 3 hours and be fine. They want to know what's going on, and they'll start looking around to try to find answers, because that's what humans do. And last but not least, it's really important that we own the flaws of our process. Now, no one's throughput, no one's efficiency, no one's length of stay, none of that anywhere, at least that I've ever found, is perfect, right? And the idea of, like, they've done studies, 60% of the time it works every time, right? That's true of most processes. So there's a certain amount of time that your process works really well. I don't know what that percentage is, but you should have a grasp on that to know that at some point your system's gonna meet critical threshold and you're gonna go over it, and you need a strategy, you need a plan to make sure that the perception of fairness doesn't get jaded, that you're being unfair or not treating people equally that should otherwise be treated equally. And when those things happen, we need to own them openly with families. We need to address them openly. We need to manage situations. We need to apologize. We need to manage perceptions, right? The sixth factor, solo waits feel longer than group waits. And this can actually be a really tricky one depending on your environment. You know, if you work in an emergency department, you're like, when's anybody ever waiting solo, right? Maybe that's the case. But there are solo waits that occur in every model. I use this picture on purpose. My first child, my 8-year-old, he was an emergency C-section at the Brigham and Women's Hospital up in Boston. Never gone through the birthing experience, first time parent. And we go in, my wife's in labor, she was in labor for a really long time, the baby's head and the pelvis, and there was all this stuff going on. The next thing you know, we're going into an OR, okay? And of course, my wife was like, I don't want anyone to know that I'm in labor. So I'm like, I don't have anyone to talk to. And so the Brigham handed me scrubs, and they put me in this hallway, and there was literally a chair, like this guy sitting in, and they said, put these on, we'll come get you when she's ready, whatever that meant. So I put the scrubs on, and I sit in a chair. It's 2 a.m, there's no one around, and I'm by myself. And I don't know how long I was out there, but it felt like 6 hours. And I was scared, and I was terrified, to a point where I called my best friend, and I was like, Karen told me not to call anyone, but like, I can't sit here alone. Like, I'm terrified, right? And I don't know if she's okay, right? And so that feeling, that unsettling feeling was very real. And so when I was going through this and I saw this, I was like, that one's really powerful when you think about it. In that moment, I was so alone that I wrote a letter to the hospital. I said, you guys have to fix this. You can't put people, dads, moms, whoever the spouse, the significant other is, out there alone. Like, I was terrified, you know, and I didn't hear back from them, but whatever. All right, I'm over it. So, but the idea is that I wanted them to understand that solo wait because they weren't thinking about it. What were they probably thinking about? The process to get my wife taken care of so something bad didn't happen to her or to the baby, which is perfect. I would rather them be okay and me not be okay. But in the moment, I was like, I can't believe this is how it's set up. So, you know, depending on your environment, I always say it's nice to have a rule where you say no one waits alone. All right, now, I'm talking about in the waiting room. So we talk about this and like, consider how you room patients in your practice, right? Whatever that practice is. If you have 4 patients come in and you normally room 3 patients at the same time, if you're a provider, decide how many patients you want. So if you like to room 4 patients and 5 come in, let's use that number instead. Don't room 4 and leave 1 out in the waiting room. Why? Because when they're alone, they start making leaps like, well, why were those people more important than me, right? Why am I out here alone? They're not even busy. Right? We get that at PM Pediatrics. We get that frequently. I'm sitting in this waiting room. I'm all alone. They have no idea that there's 12 patients and what's going on in the back, right? But that idea of when you're alone, you start kind of spinning a little bit. So you need to understand the impact of solo waits in your environment. Think about how it feels for your patients and your families. You need to come up with a strategy and a way to address that. So you can manage it through rooming patients differently. And that's how at PM Pediatrics, that's how I try to explain this to people. Like, room patients in a way that no one ever waits alone. So if you have 5 families come in and you normally room 4, room 3 and leave 2 alone. When you go to room the other patient, room 2, and now you've got all 5 into rooms, but no one ever sat alone out in the waiting room, right? So think of strategies or theories that you can use in your environment that apply to your model so that no one ever waits in your waiting room alone. Now, the other thing is from my emergency department days, much love to those people I used to work with, but we had this lovely idea of like the pull to full method, right? We have 20 rooms, fill them. And then what would end up happening inevitably is that when you looked at your incremental length of stay, is that you had these excruciatingly long waits sitting in a care room waiting for stuff to happen. So one of the important parts about the psychology of waiting when you think about the art and the science of it is that oftentimes, and particularly in academic environments where you're trying to manage length of stay, you look at incremental length of stay. And all of my experience working on projects to that effect, what they ended up doing was just shifting wait time around, but never reducing the length of stay. So the idea of getting everyone in a room faster operates on the assumption that people are actually happier the sooner they're in a room. That might actually be accurate, but at some point that happy person who's waiting in the room alone, if you think about it, because now they're just sitting there waiting for somebody to come in and they're kind of trapped or confined, right? Starts to get upset because they're like, why am I waiting so long? And it feels like an eternity when you're sitting in a room by yourself with, in my case, 3 small children. Okay, that's an eternity if it's 10 minutes for me. So the other part of this is important, is to think about the sibling or the partner or the other people that are in the room too. right? We often in pediatrics, we're very focused on the child and usually say the parent. But when the sibling's there, it's important that we manage the relationship all around. Because sometimes they feel like, they're invested in their brother or their sister's care. Like my son, when my daughter was recently sick with a stomach bug, was very invested in taking care of her, right? He was very worried about her, he was very anxious. So that helps him not have that anxiety too, even though he's not the one being taken care of. The other is to make sure your environment supports connecting them with people that may or may not be there. So, for example, that's why phone chargers are important. That's why encouraging them to make phone calls or make outreach and connect with people or FaceTime or Marco Polo or whatever you have, right? That's also a distraction technique. It's occupying time, but it also engages other people so that they don't feel alone, so that when you're not in there, they don't have that feeling, right? When the MA is not in there, whoever's in your care model, that they don't have that feeling. And then to remember that speed creates patient jams. Slow and steady wins the race, right? If you look at incremental length of stay as you break it out, I always say I want the pieces of the pie to be equal throughout the experience. What that shows me is that no one's waiting in one particular thing or for one particular thing or in one particular place for too long. When you distribute it equally, it keeps them moving through the process. The other interesting thing is that pre-process waits feel longer than in-process waits. Think about that. Think about your registration process and how people come in to your system. And if you're in our environment, in the urgent care environment, where you register your patients and you do all that stuff and you get it done and then they sit, it's like that stuff feels like it takes eternity. Why? Because they're not there to see the registration person. They're there to see the doctor, right? They don't want to talk to other people. And if you've been before, you want your registration to be very quick. You don't want to wait a long time to re-verify all of your information. So we need to think about those things and how people perceive the wait and what's happening. And the final one is, and this is an interesting one in healthcare, the more valuable the service, the longer customers will wait, okay? Now, this is a catch-22 for us. So this isn't like people lining up for the next iPhone at the Apple store, where they're willing to wait days, right, to get their pals on whatever is new. And I don't even know what iPhone we're on right now, because it's not my jam. But this isn't that. This isn't a product that people are willing to, it's not Star Wars willing to line up and buy tickets months in advance, right? So the catch-22 for us is like, well, of course our service is valuable. It could save someone's life. So it's not a question of that. So they're willing to wait because they have to, not because they want to. So value is in their eye. And in healthcare, we spend a lot of time talking about value as just being dollars, right? How much do I pay and what do I get for how much I pay? And sure, that's a problem in healthcare, transparency around costs and what, by the time I'm done with getting this, I actually don't even know what it costs. And then all of a sudden you slap me with the bill. And then I'm mad about the bill and the care, right? It kind of keeps going, it snowballs. But value, we have to remember, is in the eye of the beholder. So it could be dollars, it could be that warm and fuzzy feeling. What's valuable to that family is feeling like the people that laid hands on their child, the people that interacted with them, really cared about them at a deep and a fundamental level. So value to them isn't, I'll pay $1,000 for that, but I want the warm and fuzzies because that's what makes me feel good about the weight that I have to take in order to get the care that I want and need. Or it's the magic elixir, right? It's the potion. It's the antibiotic. It's whatever else the families come in for. So sometimes they're willing to pay whatever as long as you give them the antibiotic. And we know that, right? But that's value. The doctor going slow. I share this openly. The number one critique at PM Pediatrics is the provider being rushed in the care room. So what people value in our model has less to do with money and more to do with the time they get with the providers. For the providers out there, think about that. That's what they want. They want time with you. They want to hang out with you. They want to get your opinion. They want to ask you questions about everything, even the stuff they're not there for, right? And while you're at it, can you fix my other kid, right, who's not even registered? But they want time with you. Some people do want speed. They want it fast. My wife, I always use my wife for this example. If one of our kids is, says their ear hurts, she's the person you can go in, look in the ears, say the ears are clear. She's like, thank you very much, packs the kids up and leaves. She doesn't want you to be warm and fuzzy. What's valuable to her is her time and speed. She just trusts that the care is going to be great. And then last but not least is some people care a lot about how long they just wait in general, right? So we have to remember and think about and understand value, but value from the perspective of the person or the individuals that you're interacting with. It's not one and the same for everyone. And so this does take, the whole psychology of waiting is about understanding the ins and outs of a relationship with a person or that human, right? How you build that relationship and understand what is valuable to them and make sure that you're delivering on that value. because then it makes that wait feel okay if they're getting the warm and fuzzies, the magic potion, more time with the doctor, cost effective, etc. And then last but not least is, if you're an emergency department or an urgent care that's open late, sometimes you're just the beacon, right? The light on at night is a savior. Just knowing that somebody's there with the light on that's willing to take care of you is really important. Now, we think about our environments. If you think urgent care or emergency departments, right? Patients and families will wait longer once they arrive because they need help and there's risk associated with leaving, right? So it's kind of like one in the hand's better than two in the bush. So we have to be careful though, because this is really dangerous because we know it's like, well, they'll wait. Emergency departments, well, they'll wait. They don't have a choice. If they need care, they'll wait. The problem with that is that their future decisions aren't yet made. So that's not, the idea of this is don't give them a reason to not come back to see you. Now, if we take this and look at it by the PM Pediatrics care model, it's that the average length of stay to a discharged patient in an emergency department is around 3.5 hours. Now, it may vary in different locations, but I know in Boston this is roughly accurate. About 3.5 hours for a pediatric patient discharge. At PM Pediatrics, we'll say our average length of stay is 1.25 hours. This is one of the primary reasons why our business model actually works. It works because what is your next best alternative, opportunity cost, is to go sit in an emergency department for 3.5 hours, or you can come here and get the same level, same quality of care in an hour and 15 minutes. So people place a value on their time, which includes waiting. But the problem with every market now, instant gratification, is everyone's trying to do it better and faster. And so you start having more competition, right? So who's gonna be Amazon's competition? No one knows yet. But like every other company, somebody eventually will start to crack a code and will start shifting a bit. Right? This idea that the only thing, by the way, that the article I was mentioning earlier about Amazon said was more powerful or more profound in the idea of instant gratification or an affirmation, more than the one-click buy from Amazon, was a like on Facebook. It was one of the most powerful tools in the last 20 years, right? When we think about this sort of thing. So we have to think about no model, and the reason I'm saying this is no model is safe. Your approach is not safe. If somebody can do it faster, better, cheaper, more transparently, at a fair price, right? You're at risk of losing people because they're paying attention to these things. So you can't rest on your laurels. And so what this really is about striking that balance. So we talk about the things like being efficient. And I want to remind, like, process matters. Length of stay matters. None of this today was to say that your length of stay or your efficiency doesn't matter. It does matter, and it applies to these things. The tenets, occupying people's time, being fair, minimizing solo waits. That's part of being efficient. You can move people through your process efficiently while still thinking about psychologically how their time is occupied, how fair they perceive your care process, thinking about it from their perspective, and how you minimize the time that they spend alone. Then we think about thorough. Exam and diagnosis matter, right? Think about this. We manage anxiety through that. That's what they're there for. They want a diagnosis so they know what's going on. Explain what's happening, why you're doing what you're doing, why you're not doing what you're doing, why it's taking longer, why it's fast. Right? A very fast exam for some families doesn't work. So you need to explain why it's okay clinically that exam is fast. And then managing that uncertainty. They're clearly worried. They're uncertain about what's going on. They're uncertain about how the process works. They just want answers to questions, and it's not unreasonable for them to expect that. And at the bottom, of course, we have cost. Out of pocket matters. We have to manage that value proposition. What's valuable to them, right? The reason we pay for instant gratification type things like Prime is because we place a value on our time and effort spent doing things and when we want things. People today, the generation, the consumerism, is that we are better about placing a dollar value to our time. We're willing to pay people to do things for us so we can spend our time doing other things. This applies in healthcare. So we have to manage. And what I would posit is that if you do two of these, because you have to do all three, you have trouble. If you're super efficient and you're cost effective and you're out of pocket and pay attention to the value, but you're not thorough, they're gonna look for other options. If you're cost effective and thorough but inefficient and it takes forever, they're gonna look for other options. If you're efficient and you're thorough, but it costs way too much money, like an emergency department visit these days does, they're gonna look for other options. It's why people started shifting into the urgent care model. They were looking for other options because the cost became a problem. Not because they weren't unwilling to wait even. It was because cost becomes a problem, out of pocket, high deductibles. So in the middle though, if you can strike the balance in these tenets and how people feel while they're in their environment and pay attention to how they feel, right, you build that loyalty. And what we all know in the business of trying to get customers, patients, families to come back is loyalty is everything. But it's not forever. So if your model starts to falter, they look for the next option. They look for the Amazon. They look for the Starbucks app or the person. They look for an Uber and they switch to Lyft, right? If you can't find a car in Uber, you switch to Lyft. We're fickle. We are very fickle now, and we'll do whatever's fastest, cheaper, easier, right? So we need to think about this. We need to understand that there's no perfect prescription to all of this, right? But there is a secret, and the secret is just be human first. Back at the beginning, we talked about shifting our paradigm. The ability to look at the weight in your environment based on those 7 tenets and how it applies to them, to you if you were in their situation, and then act accordingly. Not be like, well, there's nothing we can do about it. There is something. Think of tangible things, small things, activity sheets, snacks, right, that you can do differently from what you're doing today. All right, the key takeaways. I said this in the beginning. None of the tenets are actually earth-shattering. When you think like a consumer, it's logic. That's our paradigm shift. But the question is, do you? So do you in your practice when you enter think about how long is it okay for that family to wait, 30 minutes? Or how long would I want to wait if I was them, and what can I do to make sure that they feel comfortable while they're waiting, that I'm occupying their time, that they understand how the process works, that it feels fair, it looks fair, and if it might be seen as unfair, I explain it, right? It changes the way that you practice and take care of your families. Patient and families are riddled with anxiety. We talked about that, right? That's one of our big catch-22s is we're up against it. So you need mechanisms start to finish to manage anxiety. And that takes the entire care team. It's not on one person at the front desk to do that. It's not on the provider to do that. It's everybody that interacts with every family every time needs to make sure that they're reducing anxiety through affirmation. We aren't Disney, right? I was at a conference, someone got up on a stage and was like, we are not Disney, and everyone applauded. And I said, interesting, but let me talk about it in wait times. We aren't Disney, because if we were, none of us would be sitting here, right? We wouldn't be talking about how to do this better. So we need to look at how others are doing this like Disney and figure out how we can adapt to replicate. Because there's a reason why it works really well there. It's a reason why someone stands in line for 3.5 hours to ride a ride. There's a reason they're willing to do that. There's also a reason why they're willing to spend a ton of money to jump that line, because we all know that's possible now too, right? Value comes in many forms, not just money. So when I was showing that value, you got to think about the value proposition. Don't ignore or think it's just about money. It's not. It's about many things, and it's different for every family. So we need to tailor our care and our approach to weights to families based on their situation. And last but not least, just don't forget, history conditioned us for weights in healthcare. Consumerism slowly reconditioning us through choices, and choice is power. So the game that we're playing now is that we're going to lose patients, we're going to lose families to other places because they have choices, and they're empowered to make those choices because our society has supported that and has created that in all of us. So I always like to point out, don't forget, we are all part of the consumerism society. We are all looking for instant gratification, and we sometimes shapeshift into our professional roles and forget that outside of work, our expectations of the people we interact with every day, our expectations around how we wait, when we wait, where we wait, why we wait, are the exact same as our patients and families. We need to take that into consideration, and we need to act on it. I thank you. I hope this was informative. My email's there if anyone has any thoughts, feedback, feelings, questions. I'd love to talk about this more, and I'm happy to take a couple questions from the room. I know we ran 6 minutes over. We started a little bit late, and I apologize for that. Any questions in the room here or in the chat? I think, Eric, you're on the chat. Are you on the chat?
Yes, Ali is monitoring. I haven't got it.
Got it. Thank you, everybody. Have a good one.